So picture this. June 18th, 1815. On a muddy field in what we now call Belgium, one of the most legendary battles in all of history is about to go down. This was it. The bloody final act in one of the most epic careers history has ever known. And it was a day that would redraw the map of Europe for the next 100 years.
You know who said that? The winning commander, the Duke of Wellington himself. This wasn't some kind of easy victory or a foregone conclusion. Oh no, this was a brutal, up-close, desperate fight that honestly could have gone either way at so many points during the day, which really makes you wonder.
That's the big question we're diving into. How did the master of Europe, the military genius Napoleon Bonaparte, end up suffering this final, absolutely crushing defeat? It's an incredible story of high-stakes strategy, sheer desperation, and razor-thin timing.
Okay, so after escaping his first exile from the island of Elba, Napoleon makes this incredible comeback and retakes power in France. But, the rest of Europe wasn't having it. They immediately formed what's called the Seventh Coalition to stop him for good. Napoleon was critically outnumbered, and he knew his only shot was to attack before these massive armies could all get together and invade France. This was a true all-or-nothing roll of the dice.
And look, these numbers really paint the picture. Napoleon's got about 73,000 men, and he's facing two separate armies, Wellington's mixed force and Blücher's Prussians, who combined have almost 120,000 troops. There's just no way he could fight them both at once. This huge disadvantage is what forced him to go on the offensive, to try for one of those high-risk, high-reward moves that had made him famous in the first place.
So what was his plan? Well, it was audacious, but it was classic Napoleon. Divide and conquer. He was going to drive his army like a wedge right between the Prussians and Wellington's army. Step 1, hit the Prussians hard and knock them out of the fight. Step 2, turn his entire army and smash Wellington. And you know what? It almost worked. He did beat the Prussians at a battle called Ligny, just 2 days before Waterloo. But, and this is a huge but, he didn't destroy them. And that single failure, well, it would come back to harm him in the worst way possible.
All right, so after that fight at Ligny, Wellington pulls his forces back to a defensive position he actually knew really well, a low ridge just south of a village called Waterloo. This was the ground he had chosen. This is where he was going to make his stand.
And here's where we see Wellington's defensive genius really shine. He used a tactic called a reverse slope defense. He hid most of his men just over the crest of the ridge, on the side facing away from the French. This was brilliant for two reasons. One, it hid his true strength. And two, and this is crucial, it protected his soldiers from the absolute pounding of French cannon fire. So Napoleon's gunners, they were basically firing blind at an empty hell.
But Wellington didn't just rely on the ridge. He turned 3 key spots into many fortresses to anchor his whole defensive line. You had the Château de Hougoumont on his right, the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte smack in the center, and the farms of Papelotte on his left. Think of these places like giant breakwaters, just smashing and disrupting the French attacks all day. The fight for Hougoumont alone was so intense, it ended up sucking in 14,000 of Napoleon's troops.
One of the biggest players in this battle wasn't a general. It was the weather. The battle was supposed to kick off much earlier, but a huge rainstorm the night before turned the ground into a soupy, muddy mess. This forced Napoleon to delay his attack. Finally, around 11:30 in the morning, he opens up with his Grande battery, a massive battery of 80 cannons, and just starts hammering the Allied ridge. That mud, by the way, would be absolutely exhausting for the cavalry to charge through later on.
And this is where the battle becomes truly iconic. It now enters this legendary phase, a massive, awe-inspiring clash between France's elite armored cavalry and the incredibly stubborn Allied infantry.
So at the peak of the fighting, Napoleon's most famous marshal, a guy named Michel Ney, thinks he sees Wellington's lines starting to fall back. So he unleashes one of the biggest cavalry charges in military history. We're talking about 9,000 horsemen, armored cuirassiers and lancers, thundering up that muddy slope toward the Allied center. Just try to picture that. So how on earth do you stop something like that? Well, you do it with this, the infantry square. The soldiers would form up shoulder to shoulder into a tight box 4 ranks deep, with a literal wall of bayonets pointing outwards. A horse, no matter how well trained, just isn't going to charge into a hedge of steel. It made the squares almost impossible for cavalry to break on their own.
Listen to how one eyewitness, a British captain named Gronau, described the sight. Imagine seeing that coming at you. Thousands of armored horsemen, glittering in the sun like a wave of steel about to crash over you.
The psychological terror was meant to be just as devastating as the charge itself. Now, it wasn't just the French who had a big cavalry moment. Earlier in the day, the British heavy cavalry launched their own charge and completely shattered a French infantry attack. It was amazing. But then they got carried away. They lost all discipline, charged way too far, and got absolutely wrecked by a French cavalry counterattack. It was a brutal lesson in the importance of control.
So at this point, the whole battle really boils down to this: a desperate race against the clock. Wellington's army is battered, it's bleeding, but it is just barely holding on. The big question, the only question that mattered, was could Napoleon break them before the Prussians, who were defeated but not destroyed, remember, could march to the rescue?
And right here, this is the moment Wellington almost lost the entire battle. Late in the afternoon, the French finally take that key farmhouse in the center, La Haye-Sainte, mostly because the brave defenders just ran out of ammunition. Now, the French could drag your cannons right up to it and blast the Allied squares with canister shot at point-blank range. Wellington's center was on the absolute verge of collapsing.
Man, this timeline just shows you what a nail-biter this was. Look at this. 4 o'clock, Ney's massive cavalry charges start hammering the center. But then 4:30, the first Prussians show up on Napoleon's flank, forcing him to divert troops he desperately needs. But still, at 6:30, La Haye-Sainte falls, and Wellington is in serious, serious trouble. And then, just when everything looks its absolute bleakest, at 7:30, another Prussian corps shows up and plugs right into Wellington's crumbling left flank. The timing was, well, it was everything.
Okay, so Napoleon's flank is now under attack by the Prussians. His main assault has stalled out, his back is against the wall, so he plays his last card. He commits his ultimate weapon, the one unit he had held back for the single decisive moment of the battle. These weren't just any soldiers. This was the legendary Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, grizzled veterans. They were considered the best soldiers in all of Europe. And they had never, ever been defeated in a battle where the Emperor himself was present. They were sent forward to deliver the final knockout blow to Wellington's exhausted center.
But Wellington had one last trick up his sleeve. Remember that reverse slope? Hiding there were 1,500 British foot guards. And as the Imperial Guard marched over the crest of the ridge, the British stood up as one, leveled their muskets, and fired a massive volley at point-blank range. The Guard, shocked, actually hesitated. Then came a British bayonet charge, while another regiment slammed into their flank. And for the first time in its history, the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard broke and ran.
And that one sight, that one cry of pure disbelief just spread like wildfire through the entire French army. Le garde recule, sauve qui peut. The Guard is retreating, every man for himself. The logic was simple and terrifying. If the invincible Guard was broken, then all was lost. The entire French army just disintegrated into a panicked rout.
And just like that, the battle was over. What came next was a whole new era for Europe, but it came at an absolutely immense human cost. I mean, just look at these numbers. In a single day of fighting, on a battlefield that was only a few square miles, the total casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, were just staggering. The French army lost more than half of its men. And victory was incredibly costly for the Allies too. Wellington's army took 17,000 casualties, and the Prussians lost another 7,000.
The legacy of Waterloo is just huge. It put an end to more than 20 years of nearly constant warfare across Europe. It was the final end for Napoleon and his empire. It started a century of relative peace, often dominated by Great Britain. And of course, the battle gave us that phrase we still use all the time, to meet one's Waterloo.
And that kind of brings us to the final thought, doesn't it? Wellington's army was literally moments away from breaking when those Prussians finally showed up. History so often turns on these tiny, knife-edged moments. So you have to wonder, what if the mud had been just a little bit deeper? Or the Prussian march just a little bit slower? What if they had arrived just 1 hour later?